Hello and welcome. You are watching LockdownTV. This is with unheard.com. We are on day 4 of the government-mandated lockdown. It is another glorious day outside, and most of us just have to sit looking at it through the window and stuck inside our homes. So what we are experimenting with during these days is to see whether we can gather the collected wisdom of our wonderful contributors and editors at Unheard, and see if we can get a conversation going about what we might all be thinking about during this weird period and whether it's going to have any impact on the wider world when it's finally over. So joining us today, I am delighted to say, we have Ben Gummer, the Right Honourable Ben Gummer, as I think I should probably address him, former cabinet minister, businessman, author, and general Renaissance man. He has written a wonderful piece for us this morning, drawing together some of the strands of those experiences, and we will be discussing that with him. We have our very own Ed West.
Hello.
Who is the deputy editor of Unheard. Give us a wave, Ed. Yeah, it's that one.
Yeah.
We also are delighted to be joined by Joan Smith, who you will see on the bottom of the screen, if she can hear us. And Julie Bindel, a regular Unheard contributor, campaigner, feminist, and general all-around wonderful person, and we look forward to getting her take on things later on. So thank you all for joining us. Let's start with Ben, if we can. Ben, thanks for your piece this morning. You've existence. You've been a cabinet minister doing the job Michael Gove currently does. You've been a health minister. You have written a hit book about the Black Plague, the Black Death rather, and you are now a businessman focusing on interesting new ways to develop green cities. So have I missed anything out?
Well, I wish my book had been more of a hit, but thank you for saying so anyway.
Well, maybe we'll have a second wave now. So you left Parliament in the 2017 general election. You've kept your counsel quite a lot since then. Observing all of this from home, does it make you wish you were still in the thick of it?
No, I think that even the biggest political addicts, and I'm certainly not one of them, but will be finding this very, very difficult. Those people who are in politics, who love politics, even they will find this trying. It's exhausting. It will feel like you are flying blind because there's no plan for this, and it's going to be all hands to the pump. And people will feel not only that they've got the nation's lives in their hands, but they've got the nation's economic future in their hands. But I have to say, I don't envy anyone who is in this position at the moment.
You told us an anecdote in the piece this morning about chairing a COBRA meeting. This is, I think, when you were Cabinet Office Minister in 2016 or at the very beginning of 2017. When they went through the protocol for pretty much exactly this. Tell us about that.
Well, it was actually the very last thing that I did because it was during the 2017 election campaign when I lost my seat, and they had been running the simulation for several months, and this was right at the end of it, and a few of us went to be part of what was a sort of fake COBRA. To try and test some of the ministerial reactions to the simulation that had happened. And I have to say that the preparation of officials and civil servants was astounding. People have really thought through in great detail the different kind of scenarios that could happen. But as ever, all of these plans disintegrate in first contact with the enemy. And it's very clear that no matter how good the planning of any country up until this pandemic, it's not so much that the pathogen is unknown, because it's doing more or less what people thought it might do. It's that the reaction of individual citizens and their societies is unpredictable. And because so much has happened before the pandemic arrived at us, we are responding in a sense conscious of what's happened in China and in Italy and Spain. And so that's inflected things in a way that I don't think anyone could have predicted.
So what's been different then? I mean, compared to those plans, I mean, I suppose, you know, it's too early to tell, but you know, one thing that is hopeful, at least, is that the fatality rate doesn't seem as high as maybe some of those dreadful bugs that you were planning for back in that Cobra meeting. I mean, what ways does what we're seeing now differ from those theoretical plans?
Well, I think that it's is potentially precisely what was being planned for. What I think has not been foreseen is the degree to which governments around the world have been prepared to stop economic activity in order to protect citizens. And I'm not sure anyone planned for that. And that's a really interesting outcome from this pandemic beginning in China, because it set the tone for how countries should respond. I'm not entirely sure that if it started in Western Europe, we would be deploying the same mechanisms now that we are, because we wouldn't have thought through some of the consequences which we have inherited from the Chinese response to this pandemic.
Do you think, you know, looking more at the kind of direction of travel since 2017? I mean, you were in charge of the manifesto in that election. You know, you were closely involved with those early May years. Is there any sense in which the kind of like direction of travel has retrospectively vindicated you, do you think? I mean, in the response to this crisis, and even more generally looking at the kind of nature of the Boris Johnson victory last year, you know, the kinds of rhetoric that Theresa May was using in that early period, more, you know, perhaps more culturally sort of centre-right, but more ready to intervene economically and, you know, taking care of the most vulnerable in society. Do you feel retrospectively vindicated at all?
No, I don't feel vindicated or not vindicated. I mean, I wrote what I felt was right at the time, and that's the only thing that you can do. And I don't think that any of my judgments on the way that we should govern have changed hugely either before or since. But it is good to see. It is good to see the country coming together in the way that it is at the moment. There'll come a moment when we have to look back and try and understand if we could do things better. But it's absolutely obvious that I think ministers are doing their very best with in very difficult circumstances, and not really having a plan of action ahead of them in the way that you would in most government situations. I mean, this is a problem for countries around the world where you are doing something without a known course of action.
Yeah.
And when you're in that position, it can be extremely frightening. And I credit them and also the extraordinary officials who support them with keeping things steady as we have got this far.
Your piece this morning looked a lot earlier on in history than just 2017. So let's try and zoom out and see if we can learn something from that. You were writing about the Black Death, which you wrote an entire book about, and your sense was that despite the kind of narrative that the Black Death changed society fundamentally and dramatically, which is often said, you felt that actually after a while things sort of settled down to be the same as they were before.
Yes, and I as I said in my piece, I didn't approach writing the book expecting to find that. I had read all of the literature about it, and almost all of it suggests, not all of it, but almost all of it, at least in the popular literature, suggests that the Black Death created a whole series of social changes, in this country and across Europe. And I was commissioned to write a new history of the Black Death for the British Isles, and I didn't expect to come out with a different conclusion from that, because it seems self-evident. But actually, when you look at it closely, and it was certainly my more cursory understanding of subsequent and previous pandemics, is that actually a pandemic shock doesn't really change an enormous amount. It can accelerate some things, and in some instances it can retard developments, evolutions, but actually it's responsible for very little. So all of the things which happened in the latter half of the 14th century and then on into the 15th century, they were well underway in the decades and century before the Black Death hit. And I find that actually, although at first glance that sounds a rather boring conclusion to come to, I find it quite invigorating, because what it suggests that even when you have a terrible pandemic, and the Black Death was kind of almost infinitely worse than this, more than half the population died in Western Europe. And it was an excruciating, terrible death that struck very quickly. Despite that, people picked themselves up very, very quickly, and communities returned to normal in a remarkably quick pace of events. And
so it's actually a sort of optimistic conclusion in a way. The society is not derailed necessarily by catastrophe. It has a way of finding its way back.
Yeah, and to that extent, I think there is something very different from warfare, because significant conflict, and there's a big literature on this, does have a destabilizing effect on the psyche of a community and a society. It's something about the self-wounding effect of warfare, I think, which is different from a pandemic, and because a pandemic is something
we've momentarily,
whether you ascribe it to a fact of life.
Ben, I'm gonna pause.
Did you lose me for a second?
I'm gonna pause you there for one moment, because the internet got a bit dodgy. I'm sure it's gonna come back, and I'm gonna bring in Ed. Do we have Ed West? Great. Ed, so you also wrote a piece for us based. Oh, can everyone see Ed now? Give us a wave. Yeah.
Hello, I'm in my children's bedrooms now. I've been demoted because there's piano lesson. That's the reality of broadcasting these days. So you can see my Lego collection there. And
well, many thanks to James for letting us use his bedroom as the studio today. So you wrote a piece which also looked at the Black Death, and it kind of came to slightly different conclusions to what Ben is saying, in that you felt it was actually quite an important event in terms of changing the world.
Well, I'm not a historian like Ben. I'm a history enthusiast. So I've read a lot about the Black Death, and I was wondering about what the reaction would be to our current crisis. In fact, while I've been home to distract myself, I've been reading Ben's book. Cheer myself up. It's very good. Get away from our current trouble. Think, well, only 1% of people will die, so that's something. But I was wondering what would be the reaction in terms of maybe anger towards the authorities and how people respond, because one of the traditional outcomes of the Black Death was there was a certain anger at the church, because for various reasons, the church wealth, and partly because there was a slight breakdown in order in some cities. There was, the flagellant, which had started a century before, was sort of this kind of slightly radical anti-clerical movement, which really accelerated. And there was sort of pogroms against Jews, and there was a lot. And later that century, there were religious movements like the Lollards. I mean, and a lot of this might have just been speeding up developments that had already happened, but there was a certain anger or discontent with the authorities. And I wondered this time round, would there be anger towards China, towards globalization, towards our own leaders who haven't done enough? I mean, the one parallel that is comforting is that in the 14th century, England had a very well-ordered state already. It was a very functional state, and as Ben's book says, it kind of things kept running in London even while 50% of the population was dying. All the sort of forts and guilds and sort of continued functioning throughout. And it sounds like we do have a pretty good functioning civil service today. So that's reassuring. But again, it'll be a test of different states about how well they deal with a crisis like this.
So who do you think, and let's go back to Ben and see what he thinks, who are the equivalent of the clergy now then? You know, if it turned people against the clergy and they were in some way blamed, or it was felt they didn't handle it properly, you know, who would be the equivalent now? Who are the most likely victims of a kind of anger that comes out of this, do you think?
Well, I don't think there wasn't an immediate. I mean, and this is an important parallel to draw. So, but I have to give my own version before I draw the parallel. I don't think there was an immediate reaction against the clergy, many of whom behaved heroically at the time. And it is true that subsequently there were some pretty dodgy appointments just to fill parishes because they literally ran out of people to put into clerical positions. And so there was a bit of complaint about the quality of the clergy, but frankly, you can find that in almost every decade of the Middle Ages. It's a constant complaint. What is true is that there were some quite interesting moments when the established church had to step in to stop extremism. So Ed is entirely right. The flagellants were a movement that had been around for nearly 100 years. They didn't get much of a grip in England. It's almost as if we were far too phlegmatic in this country to find it interesting, these kind of odd people traipsing around, whipping themselves in funny dress. But where they, after an initial and slightly offhand support, the church just basically banned them and said, you're causing trouble and you're not doing anyone any good. And then there was then there were the pogroms and people were doing appalling things, especially to Jewish communities. And the established church and the Pope at the time, Clement VI, was writing bull after bull saying, you've got to stop this. The Jews have got nothing to do with the Black Death. So I suppose to try and kind of find a parallel with this in what might happen now, you have a traditional tension between a proportion of the population who will want to find a reason for this happening and will want to blame China or failures in government or, you name it, it will be something. And then those people who will want to try and steady the ship and provide a bit of reason and perspective. Clearly that relies on having people who are reasonable and have perspective.
But
China is sort of responsible,
and that's one of the unknowns.
Do you might not have heard that? What Ed was saying is that China is, it did come out of China. Is that what you said, Ed?
I was saying the Chinese authorities do bear blame for how this was handled. I mean, the truth we will probably not entirely find out, but they didn't handle it very well, and they weren't very honest with the authorities. And
so
I think people can be quite reasonably angry with China for quite a lot of things, including this latest.
I mean, we were talking yesterday. We spoke to David Goodhart, who told us we need to be careful of corona confirmation bias, where basically we see all of our pre-existing political opinions just exaggerated by coronavirus, and then he laughingly did exactly that and explained why nation states and so on were going to be ascendant after this. Ben, before we let you go, what do you think is going to be the effect in terms of geopolitics? Then, if it might not change society, we might not have anger at clergy, we may not have all of the dramatic effects that some people ascribe to the Black Death, but do you think that we should reconsider our relationship with China, for example, after something like this? Do you think there should be a disengagement, or do you think there needs to be a greater attention on local supply chains or self-sufficiency, or does any of that stick with you?
Look, I don't know the extent to which the blame can be apportioned to China, and at some point we'll have to discover that. And clearly, some of the observations that we are all making about what happened in China are sinister, and that is consonant with so much that's going on in that country at the moment. But what I do know is that we will have to pick ourselves out of an enormous economic depression very quickly. And that is going to make a trade war and barriers, I think, less likely, because we just won't be able to afford it. So I suspect that I'm afraid that we will be so much concentrating on getting things straight again after this is over, that any idea of radical realignment, geopolitical realignment, is not likely to be realized. And I also don't think it's going to change us very much. I think we will continue much as we were before. I think we have all experienced something quite beautiful, which is more time with our families, and life will have slowed a bit. And we will look back on that as a special moment. But I'm not sure it's something we can continue, because life isn't like that. And it will be a rather special memory for us and our children, if we're lucky enough not to be touched by it. And for those who have the tragedy that comes out of it, it will have a different inflection. I'm afraid my rather uninteresting conclusion from this is that we should take what we can from it and be interested by it, but it's not going to change the world.
Well, that's interesting to us because it's very much not what everyone else has been saying. Thank you very much, Ben Gummer, for that. Thank you also to Ed. Thanks to James also for lending us the room as a studio.
Thank you.
We are now going to go to Julie Bindel. Are you there, Julie? I'm going to try and... I can't actually hear you quite yet. I've got... Julie is muted for me. Oh. Yes. Julie, I can see Julie saying she's not muted, and I seem to have muted her on my... Yeah. We currently have a technical issue in that I appear to have accidentally muted the wonderful Julie Bindel, and I'm unable to unmute her. I can lip read. Actually, why? Okay. We're gonna continue with this, Julie. This is going to be, I'm not sure if it's a world first, but it's a first on Unheard Lockdown TV, which is we're going to have an interview where I can't actually hear your answers, but they're going to be conveyed to me. It's going to be very interesting. Thank you for joining us. We were going to talk to Joan as well, who wrote an important piece. I thought I saw that you had read that also for us, highlighting that the home, which we are talking about as a place of refuge from potential pathogens and viruses out there, for some people isn't safe at all. And I thought she made a really important point there, which is that we need to look out for people who aren't safe when they go home and who actually need to escape.
Well, actually, Joan and I both were very involved in writing about the case of Peter Sutcliffe, the serial killer in the north of England in the 70s. And I came to that case at the end of 1979 when I was 17 years old. And it's how I found feminism, because at the time Joan was working as a young journalist in Yorkshire, where Sutcliffe was finding his prey. And at the time, the coverage, the press coverage, and the police investigation were both based on deep misogyny. We were told that in order to keep ourselves safe as women and girls, we had to stay in at night. And in fact, what feminists had been saying was that the home is the most dangerous place for women to be. Now, we're clearly in a different position now with the virus. It's very dangerous to be in public places in certain circumstances. But it still remains the case that the majority of acts of male violence are committed by men who know their victims, whether it's their daughters, their wives, their mothers, their sisters. And, there appears to be very little attention paid to this. And throughout the history of Toryism, really, it's long been the case that not enough resources are put into prosecuting the perpetrators and protecting the victims.
these issues for a long time, and you've been at the receiving end of some kind of social media treatment at various moments on that journey. Do you see any of that kind of atmosphere around the current crisis? I mean, the sense that once the kind of moral decision is made by the kind of the herd, as it were, any dissenting voice or note of skepticism is considered kind of unacceptable and gets totally kind of steamrolled. I mean, I wonder, do you think there's any danger that skeptical voices are not being heard during this debate?
I'm sure they're not. And most of us aren't medics. Most of us aren't experts. Even most medics aren't experts in this pandemic. But I think, to be honest, and I'm someone who's firmly on the left, and I refuse to leave the left just because most of the left has become absolutely bonkers. I think that
I now worried that Julie appears to have
muted me.
frozen.
All you men have now muted me.
You're back. You're back. This is cutting edge, new technology, live broadcasting going on here, Julie. I think as it is approaching past, we are going to have to leave it, and we're going to have to bring you back on another day. But I really look forward to hearing those thoughts that you shared with us that I haven't actually heard. So I will watch this back with great interest.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thanks to Ben Gummer, Ed West, and Julie Bindel. This was day number 4 of Lockdown TV. We had, as usual, some technical difficulties, and we will try and sort them out in the future. Oh, until Monday,